Hello there. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn, brought to you by the FileMaker team here at Cross IT. Before we dig in, please remember that you have a chance to win lunch on us if you leave a comment or ask a question during the live stream. Just make sure we get your email address so that we can contact you. We've looked at a couple different ways of getting data out of context, and I put that in air quotes, and we're going to be digging into another option with that today, looking specifically at the Execute FileMaker Data API script step. So we have a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so before we talk about the Execute FileMaker Data API script step, we need to take a step back and actually look at, okay, what are we talking about when we talk about the FileMaker Data API? Well, for those of you that are not familiar with that TLA, or three-letter acronym, an API is an application programming interface. In this case, it allows web services to access data that is hosted in FileMaker solutions via HTTP requests. The one that Claris has set up to work with FileMaker conforms to the representational state transfer or REST architecture, making it a RESTful API. So if you hear people talk about REST APIs, this is what they are talking about. So the actual FileMaker Data API was added to the platform beginning with FileMaker 16 as kind of like in a trial basis, and then was officially part of the platform beginning with FileMaker 17. And of course, as you might expect, just like with every other feature that has been added, the available actions have increased with each of the subsequent releases. They've been fine-tuned. And for all of the details about the API, you can see the Claris Data API and FileMaker Data API guide on the FileMaker help for more details. So that's the FileMaker Data API in general. So that's the Execute FileMaker Data API script step, of course, is built on top of that. And what that does is it allows us to execute a FileMaker Data API request using that same underlying functionality as the overall FileMaker Data API on FileMaker hosts. But what it does, it enables us to then run that script so that it's performed on any FileMaker product that's in the current file, whether that file is hosted or whether it's even running locally on your device. And it returns the data in a JSON format. Now, this specific script step was added to the platform beginning with Claris FileMaker 19. As we'll dig into it here in just a second, you'll see that this script step has three setup options. One is just a checkbox whether you want to select the entire contents or not. The second is the target, where the response is going to go once the script step is executed, which of course can be a field or a variable, as one would expect. And then you have the setup of the request, and that's where we kind of dig into this information. And actually tell us, okay, this is what we want you to send back for us. Okay, so that's the general stuff. There's a couple things to keep in mind as we get into setting up that request. Again, just to reiterate, that request is a simple JSON object, and again, the simple is in air quotes because you can make some very complex requests even though it is just a JSON object. Now, what's a little bit different between using the FileMaker Data API as a web service versus the Execute FileMaker Data API script step is that you do not need the combination of the URL, the header, the request body that are required for a normal web services API request that would be for like when you're using for FileMaker's hosted web services. So you just have to worry about the JSON payload that is telling the API, okay, this is what I want you to send back. Now for the actions, read and metadata are the only supported values. If you're using it as a web service via the host, you're also able to run scripts and update records and things like that. Where this here is we're just getting results back or getting information about our solution back. So that's why those are the only two that are supported. One of the values or keys that you're able to send as part of your request is you specify a layout many times. But what's interesting is the key layouts is actually plural. So if you don't have that correct, that's going to cause some problems. And then again, for additional details on this and some of the specifics, again, there's a link to the specific Execute FileMaker Data API result or API help information on the Carte site. Okay, so that's the request. So what does the response look like? The result is returned as in the same JSON format as when requested via a host, via the FileMaker Data API. So as you understand what that JSON looks like, how to parse it out for the FileMaker Data API, the Execute FileMaker Data API script step is going to return that same result. Now what's interesting here is that after this script step runs, the getLastError function is always going to return a 0, even if there is an error. So that means what you have to do is actually look into the JSON and understand, okay, this is where I need to check for the error. So we'll look at a couple examples of that here as we dig in. All right. So that's all the information we need to go over. Now we can go ahead and dig in here and look at some examples and kind of unpack what's going on. So what I've done here, this is based on an example from the FileMaker help there on the Carte site, where we're just going to get some metadata back about this particular solution. Because I love talking about roller coasters, we're looking at, again, my roller coaster database of information. So I'm just going to go ahead and execute the script. We'll look at the result, and then we'll dig into what that exactly looks like. So if I run the script, it spits back, which is a result which is identifiable as JSON. Okay, it's went ahead and ran some formatting on it. Here we have a messages section, and then we have the actual response that we get into down here. Now, because what I was doing, I was asking about information about the specific tables that are in this. That's exactly what it sent back to me. So we've got an array here of all of the different tables telling me what the name is and then what the base table of that data is. All right, and you can see here that the base table is coasters. There's one occurrence, and then here's another TO with the same base table, but obviously it has a different name because it is a different table occurrence. All right, so what does that script step look like, or the script look like rather? All right, so let's go ahead and get into our script workspace. So here is the script step itself. So we'll take a look at that first. Okay, again, target, can be a field, or you can set it into a variable. Okay, very straightforward. Here is that select entire contents option. Now what's interesting here is that if the field already has a value, you can have it append, which may or may not behavior that you want. So especially if you're sending the results to a field, you would want to make sure that you're selecting the entire contents, so whatever is there is replaced by the new request, if that's what applies here. If you're using a variable, if it's a local variable because you're just creating it on the fly, not so much a big a deal. But if you're using a global variable, you may want to select the entire content so that it doesn't get added on to the end as well. So something that I just recently learned, so you just want to be aware of that. And then we get into our request. Now in this case, I have the request as just a local variable here in my script. Obviously I could create the request right here and specify my calculation. I just find for troubleshooting and stuff that I prefer to use a set variable step to create my request and then just pass that as a single parameter, if you will, into the script step. Again, that's a personal preference. You can do it however you want. So let's go ahead again and take a look at this request. And so it's just a very simple, in this particular case, a very simple set element where here we are defining what our action is, and then we're telling it, okay, we want some specific metadata. So let's go ahead and get our tables. So it builds that request, executes it, and then all I'm doing down here is just taking the result that comes back in my variable and then setting it to this global field that's on my layout so that we can then easily see the result and also scroll through it, because the results can get, potentially long. All right, so let's go ahead and switch out, and let's go ahead and run it with the script debugger just so we can see what is happening. So I'm going to go down here, hit the button again to rerun the script. All right, and so it's going to build a request, and like I said, this is where, setting it separately, I kind of like, because now I can actually look at what the result or what the request is going to be before I execute the script. So if we drill in here, and you can see, okay, there's my JSON object, and it's, what I expect to see. So now I can go ahead and let that run. And we get our result. So that's a very simple example here of getting, some of the metadata. Okay. So now let's go ahead and move on. Go ahead and close that. And now we have another example here that's just going to return a record result. Okay. So again, I'll just go ahead and execute it so we can see what the result looks like. So again, we've got our two main sections here, which is the message and then the response here. Now, as we talked about, because you're always going to get a get last error of 0, you want to go ahead and actually look at the messages section here to determine, was I really successful or not? And this here is where the code is going to typically line up exactly with the error codes that you would see within FileMaker, and then the same here with the message. So you're able to key off of this code value. So here's what the response looks like, where we say we've got some data, now we've got some field, and there's actually two parts of the response. We've got the data section. Going to ignore all of that stuff for just a second, and we get down here to data info. Okay, and this is where we get some metadata about our solution, even though we don't necessarily ask for it. That's just what comes along with it. And you see with this data info, we find out, okay, what database we're in, what the overall found count is, what layout was used, what the return count is, what table, and then our total record count, which again, it's going to be there. Sometimes that's very nice information to have depending on what you are going to be doing next. Okay, and so as we come back up here to the data itself, this is where we start to look at, okay, what information was actually returned based on the response. And so here's what you're seeing here. There's a field, there's a value, field, value, so on and so forth on down through. So how does this response come? So that's probably something that we need to dig in here. So let's look at the script first. So again, we'll go back to our script workspace. And here is this script, again, set up the same way, where we're setting the variable to our request, executing the script, putting that result into a variable, and then just formatting the variable, dumping it into a global field so that we can see the result. So the key here is, let's just go ahead and look at the request. Where if we get in here and see, again, this is where our layouts comes in, where it's not layout, even though we're defining a singular layout, and then we have the limit, and we're telling it, okay, let's go with 1. So if I were to change this to 2, okay, click OK, click OK, I save that, go ahead and execute the script again. So it succeeded, which is good. Now as I scroll down here, we see we have the array where another field data object has been added with the next record from the table. And then down here you can see that our return count has jumped up to 2, even though we still have the same found count, same number of total records. So very simple thing. So that's part of where, obviously the request that you make is going to change your result. But we can also change the information that is returned here. And the way that is done is because since everything is based on the layout, if we come in here, I have a layout that's specific to API calls. Again, this is a personal preference, so you can build things however you want them to be. If you want to use data entry layouts, that's fine. I just like having segregated layouts that are only for API calls, so I know exactly what's going to be coming back. If I need to make a change, I know if I change that on this layout, it's not going to affect somebody's ability to run a report or do data entry, because all of a sudden an extra field is either there or a field has been removed. And so as you see here, this is has all of the fields. Now if I were to decide that we really don't need to see all of the timestamp information as far as when the record was created, who did it, who modified it. So if I were to go in and edit this layout, and we'll just go ahead and delete those fields easily enough. Go ahead and save that layout. We'll move back here to our test. So now you can see again, here's where that was returned. So now when I execute the script, all of a sudden those fields are gone. So just like with the normal FileMaker Data API through the web service, modifying that layout is going to adjust and change where everything comes in and what your response is going to look like. So very helpful. And again, it's just a matter of specifying that correct layout so that you get the response that you want. All right, so there's a couple of the things that we're able to do there. So now the next thing I want to dig into might take us hopefully not too much time, but it's kind of putting all of the pieces together here with the FileMaker Data API, because one of the things that we've looked at previously is the Execute SQL as an option to return information about records that are in our database without having to worry about the context. Well, using the FileMaker Data API is similar to that, and I say it's similar because I can run a script from one location and get a response back. Now obviously the response itself, because it is tied to a layout, it's going to be tied to that context. However, I can run that API request from anywhere to get the result. So like I said, it's tied to context, but not really. So that way you're able to get some information. And one of the examples that I've recently started to implement is that if I'm having to pull a report or something about related information, is that example, you have a certain number of products that are bought by a certain number of customers. You want to run, okay, well, how many places are these, who's really buying these products? So what you would potentially need to do is set up a, via your relationship, okay, here are all the products that were sold in this month. So now these are the products that we make. So now I need to go and see, okay, what products have these products been sold in the invoice line items table, and then collect that information and do another go to related records and see, okay, what invoices do these actually fall on, and so that you can get those list of customers. Well, another way to do that same thing is that if you don't want to rely on the go to related records script step, is that you can get a list of the items from your inventory, go to the line items table, get the list of invoices, and then find the invoices in a few steps. Well, this is where the FileMaker Data API is really able to go in and help us out. And so that's the example that I want to look at here. Again, of course, though, looking at our roller coasters, and I apologize because I got to go in and do this. Oh, there we go. Just go ahead and correct my spelling error so that it's not bothering me the rest of the time that we're spending together here today. All right, so what I want to do is we want to execute the script here. What it's doing, it's going to ask me, okay, I want to find each state, how many roller coaster rides have I made in that particular state. So if I pick, the state of Pennsylvania, tell it to find it, and it brings me back a list of all the roller coasters as the subsummary, and then each of the individual rides that I have recorded on that particular roller coaster. If I run the script again and switch over to, say, Ohio, perform the find, again, I get, different results. So how is that done? All right, so let's go ahead and go back to our ride experience. And this is where you can use, the way you build the request to our advantage, okay? And also the way the results are returned. So we're going to go step through this with the script debugger, but just to begin, we're getting the state. Then down here, we're running the first data API call or execute here to get all of the parks that reside in that state. The little air trapping, we come down here again, and then we say, okay, based on these parks, what are the roller coasters that are up in those parks in those states? And then we do a final find, using a slightly different method to say, okay, give me all of the rides that recorded on those roller coasters in those parks in that particular state. All right, so what does that look like? So let's go ahead and turn on script debugger. All right. And then I'm just going to go ahead and execute the script. Bring script debugger back over here onto this window so we can see it. All right, and let's pick, we'll go with Florida at the moment. All right, so I go ahead and do my find. All right, check and see whether they cancel. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to build our request to find all of the parks in that particular state. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and set the variable and then open up our data viewer so we can see, okay, what does that request look like? All right, and so this here is, as you can see, this is, again, we got our plural layouts where it's the API park ID, which is a different, this layout we want to use, and then our query, which is set up as an array. You'll notice here the square brackets, which only has one object in the array, which is right here. And our find criteria is we want to find the parks where the state equals Florida. Okay, it's pretty straightforward, right? Okay, so that looks good. So let's go ahead and step through. All right, and then we have our result coming out. So let's go ahead and look at what that result is. All right, so now this is unformatted because it's just the raw data in there. But again, here's our response right there, and then here is our message down here at the bottom. So we can see that code is 0, which is good. Okay, and that's where, as you look here, we're going ahead and pulling that or getting that element out so that we can check to see, okay, was there an error? All right, so we get that. The script continues down through. It's looking to see if there's a 401, meaning no parks were found. Okay, which is certainly a possibility. All right. Okay, so now what we're ready to do is we're ready to go ahead and say, okay, now we want to build a request to find all of the coasters that are in that particular park. Okay, all right, so let's go back to our data viewer, and so you can see what our response is. Okay, and here's a formatted version, makes it a little bit easier. And so as we scroll down here, we'll just take a look at the data info first. You can see there was 94 parks, of which we found 11. We were able to return all 11. And you can see here that there's number 1, here's number 2, here's number 3. And it looks very similar to the array that we would need to assemble for a request to get data using the Execute FileMaker Data API script step. Obviously, it has some extra information in there, but what we're able to do is in our calculation go ahead and repackage the information that was returned from the first Execute FileMaker Data API to build our request for our second use of that script step. So I'm just going to go ahead and let that script step run. So now we have our request to find all of the coasters, and so now we have our array created where obviously the layouts again is different because we're now looking at the coaster table as opposed to the park table. But instead of just having a single request that's which would be, I guess, the equivalent of an OR request, where you've got multiple find requests if you were to build it manually using FileMaker Pro, is now we've got a list with all of the parks that are in that particular state. So I think we said there was 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So it looks like we got them all. So now we can go ahead and come back to our script debugger, go ahead and execute. And we'll just go ahead and do that. We'll make sure that our result is 0, which again is what we want to see. And then here is our coaster result, which is definitely a lot more information. And let's see if we can find our, so there was 549, of which we returned 53. So it looks like definitely we returned a lot of information, again in that standard formatting for the JSON. All right. Again, a little bit more error trapping to make sure there weren't any errors. And now what I'm doing down here, like I said, this is where we switch gears. We move away from the Execute FileMaker Data API, and now we just pull out each of the coaster IDs by themselves into a return separated list. And then it comes down here and parses out each of those values and does a traditional find back here on our layout in FileMaker Pro so that we can get our results. All right, and so rather than me step the whole way through, in fact, well, let's just go ahead and do those things so we can get back in here. So we look at our coaster ID list, which again, we've parsed out all of that information that was returned as part of our JSON response to get just the IDs that we're interested in. And of course, here we've got our 53, which is what we expected based on what was returned in the data info object of the response. And so now I can just go ahead and hit play to get through the rest of it. And so now we're coming up with our pseudo report here, where you can see all of the different roller coasters that I've ridden in the state of Florida over the last 5 or 6 years. So a very helpful thing. Now what you have to do, of course, is because of how things are repackaged a little bit, to go from a response from one Execute FileMaker Data API script step over to the next request, is let's go ahead and just look at that here in a little bit of detail. And that's this script step right here. And what I did is I took advantage of the while function, because that lets me loop through it within the calculation rather than having to set up a looping operation within my script. And here is where we're declaring our initial variables. Okay. Now obviously our target field is new because the response is going to come back with the field that it was in the park table for our ID, and we need to switch it over to the coaster ID. So I'm just setting what the name of that field is here. This is just for a little bit of housekeeping, just so I get the response in a nice short variable here within my calculation, setting our index, and then getting the found count out of that data info, which is just response.datainfo.found count, and that gives us our 11 parks, I believe is what we found. Set up our exit condition. As long as the index is less than our found count, we're going to continue to loop through the repeated logic, which we find here in this second set of square brackets. So the first thing to do is to go ahead and get the field data out for that particular repetition of the loop. Okay, and so because it's an array, it's 0 based. So we just go ahead and use our index number. So you got the response from data array 0 field data. All right, that brings us here. Okay, so we've got the field ID, or the old field is just one of the list key from the JSON object that we pulled out in field data. And then this here is where I'm just substituting the old field name with the new field name because the field name has changed just because of the way my naming convention is set up. So I have to do a little bit there. And then I just go ahead and then add it back into a list so that then I have my query or my array set up. And then when that loops through the appropriate number of times, and then I just go ahead and set up where the query just becomes my result from the repeated logic, and I just go ahead and substitute out the returns with commas to put it back into an array format. And then we've got here's the layouts, and then here is my query. And then we just go ahead and execute it, and then continue on through the script. Now obviously if I used a different naming convention, or if I were finding on different things where if the field name is the same, going from one field or one table to another, I wouldn't have to go through all of that. I would certainly have to tweak it a little bit to make sure that the array is correct. And like I said, and this is again is where things are very helpful. As you'll notice here, I have a layout set up if I want to get all results for the coasters. This is the one that we had modified there earlier that has every field, but then I also have a layout set up that is specific to where, okay, I only want to get the coaster ID back. Because I know that's what I want to use then in the next step. The same thing you'll see here is for the park. I have two separate layouts that I've set up. One where it gives me all of the information I could potentially want via the API, and then I have one that's specific to the operation that I've just done. And so that's where you just have to kind of, I don't want to say play it by ear, but you certainly have to remain flexible. It may make sense to only have one layout per table. But in other cases, you may find it easier because of additional operations you want to do with that information when you get it, to have a couple of different layouts for your API responses, whether that's through the web service or through the Execute FileMaker Data API script step. So hopefully you've found that some helpful information, gives you some food for thought, things that you might be able to do and implement in your own solutions. So let's go ahead and see if we have any questions, because I don't want to be respectful of your time today. So let's go ahead and check out the questions. All right. Looks like one of the questions is how do you decide what technique to use? And I assume that means whether I find using the FileMaker Data API or some other. And I would say, obviously, the unfortunate answer is it depends. I don't know that there's any hard and fast rule. Some of it obviously is preference, because I will admit the FileMaker Data API for the web services has been around, like I said, since version 16. It's just only been recently that I've gotten comfortable with using that and integrating it, with applications, for helping with syncing and updating records and things like that for mobile apps that maybe leave the network and need to come back and sync data. So certainly there is a comfort level with the technology, and obviously you need to be comfortable with using JSON, both building it, parsing it back out. So there was a learning curve that you have to overcome, and so there's certain reasons why you would maybe stay with some of what we would consider the more traditional approaches. And then sometimes I think the first time I implemented this particular version that we looked here at the very end, with having that somewhat complex request to find multiple things and return a larger result that way, was just to see let's tackle it and see if we can do it this way in order to learn something new. So again, that's kind of how I determine is this something that's going to be used repeatedly? Is it going to help me in other projects, or is this a one-time thing that maybe I shouldn't spend as much time developing it, troubleshooting it, building all those error traps in that what you saw. So again, I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's the the answer that I have. So what are the potential gotchas for this? That's a good question. Let's see, what are the gotchas? Obviously, one of the gotchas is making sure that, especially if you're doing like the reads that we looked at here, where you're getting information back, is making sure that the layout is returning the right information and permissions are set on that layout, that no one comes in and accidentally updates it or changes it. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example of that. So I'm going to go in here, and rather than change that, I'm just going to go ahead and change the script. I'm just going to rename the layout. Okay. So a very simple change, certainly something that could potentially happen, whether you do it to yourself or someone else. So let's go ahead and get to that layout. Browse. Let's go just navigate to make sure that that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and execute it. All right. And this, of course, is the the expected result. Again, where our response is empty, but here in our message we have a code 105, which says, okay, the layout is missing. So that's again where you need to be careful. I mean, it could be a renamed layout. It could be, again, where maybe fields have been pulled off of that layout for whatever reason, but they are needed by the script that is running the Execute FileMaker Data API script step, and so all of a sudden now the information that it thought it was going to have, it's not going to be there. So that's probably a couple of the biggest gotchas that you have to just be careful. Because again, going back to what I mentioned before, is that while you're able to do things outside of the context of what the viewer is looking at, is that it's definitely still dependent on the context of the layout that you reference when you run that particular script, that particular request. So just be aware of that. So let's see, do we have any other questions? It doesn't look like we have any other questions. I guess everybody is thinking about lunch, and that's certainly okay. So let's go ahead and talk about some of our upcoming events. The next Lunch and Learn is scheduled for July 19th. We'll be back at noon. You'll get to hear Todd talk about something else. We're still in the planning stages, so stay tuned for more information on that. And then our next meeting of FMberg, which is the Pittsburgh FileMaker Developer Group, is actually not until August 2nd. We take a break in midsummer here just because of the July 4th holiday, with vacation schedules and potentially everybody being out and about. So we take July off, and then we return on our regular schedule on that first Wednesday of August. You can check out www.crossit.com/fmberg for more information about this meeting, and also to submit your RSVP. At this point, this is a hybrid session, which means you'll have the option to attend either in person or join us remotely. All right, so again, I just want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us today. If you liked what you saw and heard, please click the thumbs up and share this video. If you haven't subscribed, we humbly ask that you do so, and you can also click the bell there to be notified when we go live with new content. All right, some of the installments you see here as part of the Lunch and Learns. The content is based on questions that we've received from your questions. So if you have a suggestion for a future topic, or if a specific FileMaker problem has you stumped, please submit those topics and questions by emailing us at nutshell@crossit.com. Your idea or question may be the featured topic of a future Lunch and Learn. From all of us at CrossIT, we are glad to have served you. Have a great day.